Sent back for a limp she could not hide, she wrote one last letter west. The letter came on a Tuesday. I remember that because Tuesday was the day I hauled feed from the depot in Laredo, and the post rider caught me on the road with the wagon half loaded and the mules already ornery from the heat. He handed me the envelope without a word and rode on. I held it a long time before I opened it. Long enough that a dust cloud came up from the south and passed over me and the mules and left a fine red grit on everything, on the paper, on the back of my hands, on the rim of my hat. I brushed the hat off, left the paper alone. Her handwriting was small, careful, like she'd thought hard about each word before she committed it to ink. Some women write loose and fast like talking. Margaret Steen wrote the way she did everything else, considered, like she knew the cost of a thing before she spent it. I'll tell you about the letter in a minute. First, I have to tell you about the leg. She'd been in the territory 8 months when they sent her back. She'd come out as a school teacher, one of those women who answer an advertisement in a Kansas City paper and pack a trunk and take 2 trains and a stage and arrive somewhere the map barely acknowledges. Breda, Texas. 40-some souls if you counted generously, a river that ran brown half the year, a church that doubled as a courthouse, and a school that was a repurposed bunkhouse with the smell still in the boards. I know the smell. I'd slept in that building before the schoolteacher came. There was a crack in the south wall you could put 3 fingers into and feel the night air pushing through, and in winter it pushed hard. She hadn't been there a month when the horse threw her. Not a bad horse, a gentle mare belonging to the Alderman family, used to carrying their youngest to town. But the gully came up fast on a dark morning, and the mare shied and Margaret went down hard on the rocky slope, and her left leg broke below the knee in a way that didn't set clean. Doc Alderman, no real doctor, a man who'd read medicine when he was young and hadn't kept up, splinted it as best he could. I wasn't there when it happened. I heard about it from Cord Hosser, my sheriff at the time, who'd heard it from Clara Alderman, who'd been the one to find her and help her to the house. I went to see her the next day. She was in the alderman's spare room, propped up with her leg in a wooden splint and her face the color of old chalk. She was grading papers. She had a stack of them on her lap and a pencil in her hand, and she was working through them with a red-marked deliberateness that made me feel, standing in the doorway, that I was interrupting something important. I said I was just checking in. She said thank you and asked if the school would need to close while she healed. I said I'd see to it. She nodded and went back to the papers. That was the only time I ever saw her in a bed. I want to say that because the image of her, propped up in that room with papers on her lap, is the image I keep coming back to. Not the morning on the stage, not the coffee shop in Kansas City, not the lamplit street. This one. Broken leg, chalk pale, grading papers. That's the woman she was. By spring she walked with a hitch. Not a terrible hitch, but a hitch. And the school board, 3 men, 2 of whom had opposed hiring a woman in the first place, voted to send her back to Kansas City. Said the children needed a teacher who could stand all day without trouble. Said a woman with a bad leg in rough country was a burden waiting to happen. Raymond Prout, not the same Prout who later took my job, a different one, a rancher on the board, said it plainly at the meeting. She was a liability the town couldn't afford. I was sitting in the back of the room because Hosser had asked me to attend in case there was trouble, and when Prout said that word, liability, I felt something tighten in my jaw that I didn't show on my face. There wasn't any trouble. The vote was 2-1. The one dissenter was a man named Fike who ran the general store and who I'd always respected for quiet reasons. He said afterward outside that it wasn't right. I said I agreed. We didn't do anything about it because neither of us knew what there was to do. They gave her $40 and a seat on the eastbound stage, and the Christian charity of seeing her to the road. I was the one who loaded her trunk. I was the deputy then, barely. I'd been riding for Sheriff Cord Hosser for 2 years by that point. Hosser was getting old and his eyes were going, and half my job was covering for that without either of us saying so out loud. I wasn't much. 41 years old, no family, no land. A man who'd been useful enough to stay employed and ordinary enough to be ignored. I'd lived in Breda long enough that the town had stopped seeing me the way you stop seeing a fence post. You know it's there. You just don't look at it. I carried her trunk to the stage. The trunk was heavier than I expected. Books mostly. She'd brought a crate of books out from Kansas City and she was taking them all back, which seemed right. She thanked me. She didn't cry. I'd half expected her to cry because I'd seen grown men cry when they got run out of a place they'd tried to make work. She didn't. She looked at the stage, then at the street, then at me, and that look stayed with me. Not sad, not bitter, something harder to name. Like she was making a record of a thing, putting it somewhere in herself where she'd keep it. The stage left. I stood in the street. Then I went back to work. I didn't think about Margaret Steen for a while because there was too much happening. Hosser's eyes got bad enough that he had to tell the county, and the county sent a new sheriff up from San Antonio, man named Prout, young, fast with his mouth and his politics, the kind of man who makes you feel like an obstacle without ever quite saying what you're in the way of. Slick-haired and good with a handshake, the kind of man who runs for things. He kept me on. For about 4 months he kept me on, and I did my work, and I did it well, and I tried not to let it get to me that he was taking credit for the work in the weekly dispatches he sent to the county. Then one Tuesday morning, not the Tuesday of the letter, a different one, he told me he was bringing in his own man, and I could stay on as a part-time deputy if I wanted, half pay, or I could move along. I moved along. That's what you do. That's what men like me do. You don't make a scene, and you don't beg, and you don't burn anything down on your way out, even when you want to. You shake hands with the man who just cut you loose and you go. I'd done it before. I'd do it again, probably. The frontier wasn't short of men like Prout, and it wasn't short of situations like the one I was walking out of. What I did when I left Breda was I rode north a day and then west into the hill country, and I sat by a stream for 3 days and I let myself be angry. Just alone and angry, which is sometimes what a man needs. I built a fire each night. I ate what I had in my saddlebags. I thought about the 2 years in Breda and what they'd added up to, which was nothing I could put in my hand, and about the 2 years before that in a town called Dalhart that had also ended in walking away, and about the 10 years before that riding county lines and doing work that needed doing, and then moving on when the work was done, or the man who hired me decided he didn't need me anymore. 20 years of that. 20 years of being useful enough to stay and ordinary enough to discard. I put the fire out on the 3rd morning and I rode south. I hired on with a freight company out of Eagle Pass. 6 months of that, hauling goods between towns that had nothing the other towns needed badly enough to justify the trip. The other men on the crew were decent, a mixed lot, older men mostly, men who'd been at something else before and ended up here, which was a kind of kinship I understood without having to put words to it. We didn't talk much about where we'd come from. You learn not to ask that in certain kinds of work. You just drive the wagon and do the work and eat together in the evening, and that's enough. Then I got let go from that too. Company sold, routes changed, men let go, new ownership didn't want the old crew. The foreman told us on a Thursday, gave us our pay through Friday, and that was the end of it. I rode into Laredo with a horse, a bedroll, and money enough to last me a few months if I was careful. Then I did some work for a rancher named Tilly's who had a problem with rustlers running stock across the border. Tilly's was a hard man, fair in his way, the kind of rancher who'd built everything he had from nothing and had the hands to show for it. He didn't much like talking, but he paid in cash, and he paid when he said he'd pay, and those are the 2 things that matter most in that kind of arrangement. The rustling problem got solved, partly through sitting up nights in cold draws, and partly through one very bad morning that I don't need to get into here, except to say that there were 2 of them, and one of me, and afterward there was one of them and one of me, and then there was just me, and I spent half a day burying the one I hadn't killed the way his mother would have wanted him buried, which is more than he deserved, and also exactly the right thing to do. After Tilly's, I had nothing. I'm not going to dress that up. I had a horse that needed shoeing, a bedroll, $42, and a rented room above a saddle shop in Laredo. I was 44 years old. I'd spent more than 20 years in this territory doing work that mattered, work that kept people safe, kept order, kept the rough country from eating the soft parts of civilization whole. I'd recovered stolen horses and recovered stolen cattle and held dying men's hands and stood between armed men and the things they were trying to destroy. I'd done all of it well enough to keep being hired, which is the only review you get in this line of work. And what I had to show for it was a horse that needed shoeing and a saddle shop ceiling to stare at. I wasn't drinking. I want to be honest about that because it's the thing most people assume. I'd seen where that road went for men like me, and I'd taken enough steps down it a year, 2 years back to know I had to stop, and I had. Stone stopped. I was grateful for that. But not drinking when you've got nothing is its own kind of hard. You're just awake in the dark with it. You're just alone with everything you've been pushing aside, and at a certain hour it all crowds in, and there's no fog to put between you and it. You're just there with the weight of what your life has been and what it's likely to go on being. I'm not sure I was thinking about dying, but I'm sure I wasn't thinking much about living. There's a territory between those two that a man can occupy for a long time without it resolving either way, and that's where I was. Just existing, getting through days, loading feed when there was feed to load, eating when I remembered to eat. Sitting on the edge of the bed in the evenings looking at $42 and thinking about math in a way that wasn't really about math. That was where I was when the post rider came up beside the wagon on the Laredo Road. I sat on the wagon seat in the road with the letter in my hands and the red dust settling on everything, and I read it. She wrote, "I have been thinking about Breda and whether thinking about it is worthwhile, and I have decided it is. Not because Breda deserves it, but because some things that happen there deserve it, and I am not in the habit of letting things go unacknowledged." She wrote, "I am in Kansas City. I am teaching here a school for girls, 6 days a week, morning to afternoon. My leg is not right. It will never be right. This is something I have made my peace with, though peace is perhaps the wrong word. Coexistence is closer. I coexist with the leg." She wrote, "I heard from Clara Alderman that you no longer ride for Prout. Clara writes to me still. I don't know why I am telling you this except that I thought you should know I heard." Then she wrote something I wasn't expecting. She wrote it in the middle of the letter, plain, without apology. "I am telling you something that may be none of my business, and if so you may discard this letter and I will not know and no harm done. But I remember the way you looked the morning the stage left. Not sad on my account, I don't think it was that. I think you were just diminished. And I thought about that word for a long time afterward. Diminished. And I thought it was wrong, actually. You weren't diminished. You were being diminished by a town that had gotten used to you and stopped seeing the difference between a good man and a fence post. And I thought, well, I thought someone should say it, so I am saying it." She wrote, "You are not a fence post." She wrote, "I don't know what you are doing now or where you are, and the address I have for you is 3 months old and may be no good. But if this finds you, I am at the address below. I teach until 4 o'clock. After that I am usually home. There is a decent boarding house on the next street and decent coffee at the shop below it, and if you are ever in Kansas City, there is no reason you could not have a cup." That was the end of the letter. I read it twice. I held it between my fingers and I read it a third time, slower, like there was something in it I needed to find that was hidden between the sentences. There wasn't. It was just what it was, a careful woman who decided to say a plain thing and had said it. I folded it and put it in my shirt pocket. Then I finished loading the feed because I'd been paid to load the feed and I was going to finish what I started. The mules were patient about it, or at least tired enough to stand still, which is the same thing in a mule. I drove back to the saddle shop and I unhitched the mules and I rubbed my horse down, and I gave him water, and I went upstairs, and I sat on the edge of the bed, and I took the letter out again. You are not a fence post. I don't know when the last time was that anyone had said anything like that to me, straight like that, without softening it or making it about something else or wrapping it in something else to make it easier to say. She just said it, like a fact, like she'd looked at a thing and named it the way you name a rock or a river, not to be poetic, not to be kind, just because that is what the thing is and it's correct to say so. I'm not a man who cries. I'm not saying that to sound tough, it's just the way I'm made. Whatever it is in a man that goes to crying when he's hurt or overwhelmed, mine goes somewhere else. It goes quiet, goes still. That's all it does. I sat there with that letter, and something moved in my chest that I hadn't felt in a long time, some old dislodged thing. And I put my elbows on my knees, and I put my face in my hands, and I sat very still for a while with the letter between my fingers and the afternoon light coming sideways through the window and the sound of the street below going on without me. I wrote back 3 days later. I wrote slowly because I'm not a careful writer the way she is. I started 4 times and threw the first 3 tries in the stove. I sat at the small table by the window with the pen and the paper, and I tried to say something that was true and also something that a man could send without it being too much. It's a difficult line to walk. You don't want to say nothing. But you don't want to say everything either, especially not on paper, especially not to a woman you've only spoken to twice, and one of those times was when she was flat in a bed with a broken leg. What I finally sent was short. I said I'd gotten her letter and I was grateful for it. I said I was in Laredo, but I didn't expect to be there much longer because the work had dried up. I said I wasn't sure where I was going next. I said Kansas City was a long ride from Laredo. Then I crossed that out. I didn't want her to think I was making excuses or that I was the kind of man who counts the miles between himself and a thing he wants. I wrote it again without the word long. Just Kansas City is a ride from Laredo. A man could make it. I mailed it and waited. She wrote back in 11 days, which meant she'd answered the same day my letter arrived or the next morning. 11 days for the mail to go from Laredo to Kansas City and back again. The frontier's own kind of miracle, when you think about it, words traveling faster than any of us on horseback. She said she was glad the letter had found me. She said the boarding house on the next street had a room available and the rate was fair, and the woman who ran it, Mrs. Garner, was quiet and ran a clean house. She said she had not told Mrs. Garner to expect anyone. She had not assumed, but she thought I should have the information. She did not say, "Come." She didn't say that. She gave me facts. She laid out the landscape, the school, the boarding house, the coffee shop, the clean house. Then she let me decide what to do with the landscape. That was Margaret. That was exactly her way. She didn't pull. She just opened a door and trusted that a man who was meant to walk through it would walk through it in his own time. I sat with that letter for 2 days. I don't know how to explain what a letter like that does to a man in my situation. Maybe you know. Maybe you've been somewhere low enough that a hand reaching down to you, not to rescue you, not with pity, just to offer you a fact, just to say here is a thing that exists and you could use it if you choose. Maybe you know what that does. It doesn't fix anything. The $42 is still $42. The horse still needs shoeing, but something shifts. Some weight that's been sitting on your chest shifts, just slightly, and you can breathe at a slightly different angle. I got the horse shod. It took me another 4 days after that to pack up and settle with the saddle shop landlord and get on the road. I'm not sure why it took 4 days. I wasn't talking myself out of it exactly. I think I just needed to sit with the fact of it, the fact of choosing something, of moving toward instead of just moving away. Moving away was something I was practiced at. Moving toward felt different, felt like it required more care, like you had to be sure you were doing it right. I rode north out of Laredo on a Thursday morning, with the sun coming up behind me, and the Rio Grande glinting brown through the brush to my left. It was already hot, and it was going to get hotter, and I had the road mostly to myself for the first 2 hours, just me and the horse and the mesquite, and the sound of the hooves on the packed earth. I thought about Breda. I thought about the years I'd put into that place, the brawls I'd settled, the horses I'd recovered, the livestock disputes I'd mediated between neighbors who'd known each other 20 years and still managed to hate each other over a fence line. I thought about the 2 men I'd buried who'd died stupid and violent and young, and the 1 man I'd buried who didn't deserve to die that way, who I'd failed to get to in time, who I still carry. You carry all of them. That's part of the job that no one tells you about when you pin on the badge. You carry the ones you saved, and the ones you couldn't, and the ones who didn't want to be saved, and the whole long weight of a territory that needs men like you to do the work and never once says thank you for it. I thought about Hosser, his eyes gone bad, his hands shaking a little in the mornings that last year, the way he'd still ride out when he needed to because some things you don't hand off to a deputy even when the deputy is perfectly capable. I thought about the handshake he'd given me when I left, not the quick professional shake of acquaintances but the full grip, both hands almost, the kind of handshake that says I know what this is and I'm sorry for it. I didn't blame Hosser. He'd done everything a man in his position could do. The county made the decision, and he'd had no say in it. I thought about Prout, and I let myself be angry for a stretch of road, because a man has a right to be angry when he's been used and thrown over. I let it run hot for a while, which it needs to do sometimes, and then I let it go because anger at a man like Prout is like being angry at weather. It doesn't change the weather. It just makes you cold and wet and also angry, and there are better things to spend yourself on. I slept rough the first 4 nights, rolled out my bedroll under whatever cover I could find, which in that country is usually a stand of mesquite and the sounds of things in the dark. There's a particular silence the Texas scrub makes at 2 in the morning, not true silence, because the crickets are going and something's moving in the brush over that way, but a silence underneath all of that, a held-breath silence, like the land itself is waiting to see what the night is going to do next. I'd slept in that silence 1,000 times. It had its own comfort in it. The kind of comfort that's not comfortable exactly but is known, and known is its own kind of good. The second night out, north of Uvalde, I built a fire against a limestone outcrop, and I sat with my back to the stone and my boots off and my socks drying on a nearby rock, and I read her letter again. I'd been carrying it in my shirt pocket since Tuesday. The grit from the road was in the creases now, and one corner had gone soft from sweat, but the words were still clear. I read it by firelight, moving my lips a little the way I do when I'm reading something I want to understand exactly. She'd said, I am not in the habit of letting things go unacknowledged. I thought about that phrase for a long time, the habit of acknowledging things, the deliberate practice of it. Most people don't acknowledge things not because they're unkind, just because they're busy. They're inside their own lives, and the things other people do and are and carry move past them like water around a stone. You don't blame the water. But here was a woman who had built a habit out of the opposite of that, who had looked up, who had kept looking. I thought about the 8 months she'd been in Breda before the accident. I tried to reconstruct them. I'd seen her around at the store when she came in for supplies, at church on Sundays, on the road to school in the mornings with her bag of books, but I'd never spent much time in conversation with her. A word here, a word there. She was private in a way I recognized because I was private in a similar way, not unfriendly, just not given to filling space for its own sake. A lot of people on the frontier are like that. It's either the solitude that makes you that way, or you were already that way and the solitude suits you. But she'd been watching, quietly, without making anything of it, without any of it being about her watching. She'd just been paying attention. To the town, to its people, to the 1,000 small visible things that happen when human beings try to keep a place running and decent and alive. And somewhere in that attention, she'd noticed me. I put the letter back in my pocket. The fire was getting low and I let it go. The stars were extraordinary out there, no competing light for 50 miles in any direction, just the full dark sky doing what it does, which in that country is almost violent in its completeness. I lay on my back and I looked at it for a while. After 20 years on the frontier, I still couldn't name most of what was up there, but I'd learned to stop feeling like I should be able to. Some things you just receive. I thought, it is enough to be lying here on my back in the Texas scrub on my way somewhere. It is enough that there is a somewhere. That is already more than there was last Tuesday. North of San Antonio, the country changed. Greener, more water, more trees standing upright and meaning it. I'd spent so long in the scrub and the dust that trees standing that way looked almost theatrical to me, like they were performing being trees, but they were real. The grass got longer and the sky felt different, closer maybe, less wide. The land was asking different things of the people on it. That was fine. I'd learned to read what land was asking. I passed through a town called Lockhart on a Friday, and there was a market on the main street. Produce and livestock and cloth and small goods laid out on tables. People moving between them in that particular market day way, unhurried but deliberate. I stopped at a table run by an old woman who had a dozen kinds of preserved food in labeled jars, and I bought a jar of peach preserves because it was there, and I hadn't had peach preserves in years, and I thought, if I am going to be living in a city, I should arrive with something besides what's in my saddlebag. It seemed important, like I was practicing a kind of life I'd been out of practice with. The old woman wrapped the jar in paper and string and said, "You traveling far?" I said, "Kansas City." She looked at me. She said, "That's a ride." I said, "It's a ride." She said, "You got people up there." I thought about how to answer that. I said, "Getting to." She smiled at that. She said, "Good, that's the right direction." I've thought about that conversation since. Getting to. Like it was something I was in the process of making rather than something I already had, which was exactly right, which was the only honest way to put it. I crossed into Missouri on a morning when the clouds were low and heavy, and the air smelled like it was going to rain but didn't. I passed through towns that were bigger than anything in the territory I'd come from, towns with paved main streets and gas lamps and two-story buildings with painted signs. People looked at me the way town people look at men who come off the trail, not unfriendly, just cautious. I didn't blame them. I probably looked like what I was, a man who'd been sleeping rough and eating poorly and riding hard and hadn't had a proper bath in 10 days. I stopped at a hotel in a town called Millerton one night, paid $1.50 for a room with a real bed and a basin and a pitcher. I had a bath. I brushed my coat out and brushed my hat. I looked at myself in the mirror over the basin for a while, which is something I don't do much of as a general rule. What I saw was a man I recognized but didn't always feel the continuity with. 44, gray at the temples, the kind of face that's been weathered into something specific. Lines from squinting at sun and distance, jaw that looked like it was used to being set, eyes that had seen things and noted them without expressing much about the noting. I thought this is what she would be agreeing to. This man right here. Whatever she thought she saw in me and Breda, whatever was worth writing to, she'd be agreeing to this. Whatever it goes into, whatever it becomes. I thought that was all right. I hit Kansas City on a Tuesday afternoon. Everything seems to happen on Tuesdays. I can't explain it. And it was bigger and louder and more layered with smell than I'd remembered or imagined. The noise of it hit me a block before I rode into the main streets. Wagon wheels and horse hooves on cobblestones and voices, layers of voices, and somewhere a steam engine blowing off pressure in a long flat scream. Coal smoke and bread and horse, and the river somewhere not far, that brown damp smell of moving water. I sat on my horse at the intersection of two wide streets and watched the traffic pass and felt approximately as out of place as a man can feel without actually being somewhere he doesn't belong. I wasn't sure the difference, but I thought about Margaret walking these streets 2 years. I thought about her making this city work. If she could do that, arriving with a bad leg and a trunk of books and $40 and nothing else, then a man like me could find a boarding house and a cup of coffee. I found the boarding house on the second street I looked. Mrs. Garner was a small woman in her 60s, with a direct way of looking at you that reminded me immediately of certain women on the frontier who'd raised families in hard country and outlasted everyone around them by virtue of simply refusing to stop. She had gray hair pinned up tight and a clean apron and hands like she'd used them her whole life. She looked me up and down with the frank assessment of a woman who had seen a great many men come through her house and had learned to read them quickly and accurately. She said, "Miss Steen wrote you might be coming by." I said, "She told you to expect me." She said, "She told me I might receive an inquiry. She did not commit either of us to anything." She showed me the room. It was small and clean, and the window looked out on a courtyard with a single tree, an oak young, not much taller than the second floor, and a cast iron pump. The bed had a real mattress. The floor had been swept recently. There was a peg on the wall for coats and a small chest for clothes and a table with a lamp on it. Everything necessary. Nothing extra. I said I'd take it. She said a week in advance. I paid her. She seemed satisfied by that in a way that meant she'd had enough men offer to pay later that she appreciated it when they paid now. She said, "Supper's at 6. I don't hold it for anyone. Breakfast at 6:30. I said I understood. She said, "Do you have a horse?" I said I did. She said, "There's a livery 2 streets north run by a man named Cole. Fair prices. Tell him I sent you." I thanked her and found the livery and got my horse settled with water and feed, good hands on him. And then I found my room again, and I put my saddlebag in the corner and I sat on the bed. I didn't go to the school that day. I didn't know what I was going to say, and I didn't want to say the wrong thing, which is the same problem I'd had with the letter. It's easier to fix a letter. You can throw it in the stove and start over. You can't do that with words you've already said to a woman's face. I found the coffee shop below the boarding house. I had a cup and then another. It was good coffee, better than anything I'd had in Laredo or Eagle Pass, proper roasted and proper made. I sat by the window and I watched the street, and I tried to organize myself into something that made sense. The street was busy with end-of-day traffic, workers heading home, a man selling something from a cart who called out the same thing every 30 seconds in a voice designed to carry a city block. I watched him for a while. He was good at his job, whatever it was. There's a kind of competence in that, in knowing how to do the particular thing you need to do in the particular place you're doing it, that I respect regardless of what the thing is. That night I wrote a third letter, short, practical. I am in Kansas City. I am at the address below, which I think you may know. I will be here for a time. If you want to have coffee when you are done with school, I will be at the shop downstairs. I signed it with my name, Jesse Crail. I left it with Mrs. Garner to be sent to the school in the morning. Then I had supper in the dining room, pork and potatoes and bread, plain and good, with 2 other boarders, a quiet young man who worked in printing and an older man who'd come to the city for some kind of medical consultation and seemed not to want to talk about it, so we didn't. We ate in a comfortable enough silence. Mrs. Garner came and went from the kitchen. She had a cat that sat under the table and watched the food with the patience of something that has learned that patience is the only strategy available to it. I slept better that night than I had in weeks. The mattress partly, but partly something else. Something having resolved or begun to resolve. The direction was set. Whatever happened tomorrow would happen, but the direction was set, and that was something. She came at 4:15 the next afternoon. I was at the window table with a third cup of coffee. My second day of taking too much coffee, a habit I was going to have to manage. And I saw her coming down the plank walk before she came through the door. The hitch in her step was exactly as Clara Alderman had described it in a letter to someone, I couldn't remember who, that I'd happened to hear about. Left leg, a slight draw and set to it, not labored, just the particular gait of someone who had made their peace with the mechanics of how they move through the world. She had a gray wool coat, good quality, a little worn at the elbows. A canvas satchel over one shoulder full enough to pull it down. Her hair was up. She wore no hat. She came through the door, and she saw me at the table and she stopped. Not startled, just pausing, the way a person does when they've thought about something so many times in advance that actually encountering it requires a moment of adjustment. Something crossed her face. I couldn't read all of it. I caught part of it, something glad, something also careful. She was being both things at once, which seemed right. She came and sat down. We ordered coffee. She put the satchel on the floor beside her chair. She looked at me and I looked at her, and for a moment we were just doing that, just looking, which is a thing you can do with a person you've corresponded with that you can't quite do with a stranger. We'd already said things to each other on paper. The looking was catching the face up to what the letters had established. She was older than I'd remembered her being, but then I was older than I'd been, and the West had put things in her face, not damage, more like definition, like experience had sharpened what was already there. The resolve I'd seen on the morning of the stage was still in her features, but it was settled now, not braced against anything, just present. She said, "You came a long way." I said, "It's not that far." She looked at me for a moment, then she said, "Yes, it is." I said, "Yes, it is." She smiled at that, small, private, the kind of smile that doesn't perform itself. We sat there. The coffee came and we both held our cups and the room went on around us and we talked, not fast, not nervously, just two people who have been at enough hard things that they know what easy feels like by contrast and they don't waste it. She told me about the school. 12 girls, ages 8 to 15, and she described each of them in a few words that I could immediately picture. The serious one who wanted to be a botanist, the one who cried over arithmetic but had memorized the names of every state in the Union, the two daughters of the printer who came in pressed and perfect and left every day with ink on their cuffs and grass stains on their knees, which she found privately gratifying. She said she liked the school, said it in a flat way that meant she meant it, not as a bravery or a consolation but as a plain fact. She had found the thing she was supposed to be doing and she was doing it. I told her about Tilly's and the freight company and Eagle Pass. I told it plainly, the way I'd told things to Hosser, the facts in order, no embellishment. She listened the way she'd listened to everything, which is to say she actually listened, which is rarer than it sounds. After a while she said, "What will you do here?" I said, "I'm not sure. I know pipes. I know horses. I know how to keep order, though I'm not sure that's a thing they need from me in the way it's a thing I know." She said, "Mrs. Garner has had a leak in her cellar pipe for 2 months." I said, "I heard about that." She said, "From whom?" I said, "From her, last night." She nodded. She said, "There's a man at the precinct who might talk to you. His name is Hanson. He's been trying to hire men who know the territory, men who have worked as deputies or marshals, because they're getting more people coming through from out west and they don't always know how to talk to them." I said, "You've been doing some thinking." She said, "I've been doing some thinking for about 3 months." I looked at her, she held it. I said, "That's when you wrote the first letter." She said, "I wrote 3 versions before the one I sent, threw the first 2 out." I said, "I threw out 3 before the one I sent back." Something eased between us at that, like we'd both been carrying something slightly too carefully and had set it down at the same time. She said, "I wasn't sure you'd come." I said, "I wasn't sure either." She said, "What decided it?" I thought about that. About the saddle shop ceiling and the $42 and the mules in the dust road and the red grit on the letter, and what the letter had felt like in my hands, and what I'd felt in my hands when I was reading it. Not warmth, exactly, but something waking up that had been asleep. I said, "You said I wasn't a fence post." She didn't smile. That's the thing I remember most about that moment. She didn't smile. She looked at me steady and she said, "You're not. Whatever they made you feel like, that's what they did to you. It wasn't true." That's when it let go. Not dramatically. There was no scene, no breakdown. Something in me that had been pulled tight for a long time, knotted there, years of it maybe, just let go. I felt it happen. The way a fist slowly unclenches. The way a room you've been holding your breath in finally gets a window opened in it. I sat there with my coffee and I just breathed. After a moment I said, "I'm not sure what to do with Kansas City yet." She said, "You don't have to know what to do with all of it at once. Mrs. Garner's pipe is a good first thing." I said, "I know pipes." She said, "I know you know pipes." I looked at her. She said, "You fixed the one at the school in Breda. Second week I was there, before anyone was up. I was there early marking papers and I heard you in the back room and I didn't say anything because I could tell you didn't want to be seen doing it." I sat with that. I said, "That was a long time to carry something like that." She said, "Some things are worth carrying." The coffee shop was filling with the end-of-day crowd. The printer's daughters walked past the window with their mother, coats buttoned up against the evening air, the younger one with ink on her chin that her mother hadn't noticed yet. The gas lamps on the street were being lit one at a time by a man with a pole, moving from lamp to lamp in an unhurried way, like a man who understood that the lamps were patient and could wait for him. I said, "The man you mentioned, Hanson." She said, "He comes to the school sometimes to talk to the girls about the city. He'd remember me if I introduced you." I said, "That would be good." She said, "It might be." We sat there another while, not saying much, not needing to. The room went on around us and the street outside went on, and the gas lamps added themselves one at a time to the evening. There was something almost remarkable about sitting in a warm room with a cup of coffee and a woman who was not doing anything except being there and it being enough. Just enough. Without any performance around it, without anyone needing anything from it except exactly what it was. After a while she said, "Clara Alderman still writes to you." She said, "Every month or so." Clara is a faithful correspondent. She told me when Hosser's eyes got bad enough that he told the county. She told me when Prout came. She told me when you left. I said, "Clara knew I was leaving." She said, "Clara knew everything about Breda. She just didn't let on that she did." The Aldermans were that way. They ran the house and the house saw everything. I thought about Clara. Quiet, deliberate woman, always with something doing in the kitchen, always at the edge of whatever was happening in town without quite being in the middle of it. I remembered her being the one to find Margaret after the fall and get her to the house. That was Clara, present when it mattered, gone before you had to thank her. She said, "She thinks well of you, Jessie." She said so in the letter where she told me Prout had let you go. She said it was a shame and that you were one of the good ones. I didn't say anything to that. She said it stuck with me, because I'd thought the same thing. A year and a half before that, sitting in the alderman's spare room grading papers with my leg in a splint, I'd thought it. And then I put it away because it didn't seem like something I had a use for. And then Clara wrote it and I took it back out again. I said, "I didn't know any of this was happening." She said, "No, you were out there being unacknowledged." The way she said it, flat, almost dry but with something precise underneath it, made me feel seen in a way I hadn't been prepared for. Not just the feeling of being seen but the accuracy of it. Unacknowledged. That was the exact word. Not invisible. Just unacknowledged. Like the work existed but no one had put their name to noticing it. I said, "That's a careful word to pick." She said, "I'm a careful person with words. It's an occupational habit." I said I'd noticed. She said, "The letters." I said, "The letters, and before that, in Breda, you didn't waste words." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Most people fill silence because they're afraid of it. I'm not afraid of it." I said, "Neither am I." She said, "I know. I noticed that too." Outside the window the lamplighter was moving down the street, pole in hand, steady as a man doing work he's been doing for years and finds uncomplicated. Light moved behind him down the block. The street changed quality in it, not brighter exactly, just more itself, more particular and defined. I said, tell me about the school when you started here, how that went. She looked at me for a moment, deciding whether I was asking to be polite or because I wanted to know. I wanted to know. She must have seen that. She said, it was hard at first. Not the teaching I knew. The city was hard. I'd been in small places most of my life. Small places have problems, but the problems are at a size you can see the edges of. The city is problems at a size you can't. I lost my way twice in the first week, which is embarrassing for a grown woman to admit, but there it is. I stood on a corner trying to read the street signs, and a woman my mother's age stopped and asked if I needed direction, and I said yes, and she walked me 4 blocks to where I needed to be. She didn't make a thing of it, just walked me and said goodbye and went on about her business. She said, that was the first time I thought, all right, people here will do that. It's just there are a great many more of them and each one has to decide independently to do it. It's not like Breda where everyone knows everyone and no one cannot help you because they'd see you at church Sunday. It has to be chosen, but people choose it, often enough. I said, did the leg give you trouble, the city streets? She looked down briefly. She said, cobblestones they're not ideal. For the first few months I walked very slowly on them. There's a technique once you know what the leg will and won't do. I know it now, but learning it was some falls. One of which was in a market in front of a good number of people, and I sat there on the cobblestones for a moment and I thought, you can cry or you can get up. So I got up. She said it the same way she'd said everything else, like a report, like a woman who has decided that her own story is material to be managed rather than lamented. I said, and then what? She said, a man from one of the nearby stalls came over and didn't touch me or hover, just stood nearby until I was standing, and then he went back to his stall. I bought an apple from him on the way home. He charged me 2 cents less than the sign said and didn't say anything about why. I said, that's a good story. She said, I thought so. She said she had papers to mark. She said it the way she'd say anything, without apology as a fact. She stood. She put on her coat, buttoning it from the bottom, which I noticed because I'd noticed similar things about her before, the way she always went bottom to top, methodical, and she settled the satchel strap on her shoulder. She looked down at me and I looked up at her. In the window behind her the street was going dark and the lamps were lit now, all of them, and in that light she looked entirely herself, the hitch in her leg, the careful eyes, the set of her jaw, the wool coat worn at the elbows. Not softened, not made pretty by the light the way some lights do that, just illuminated, which was the right word for it. She said, I'm glad you came, Jessie. I said, Margaret. She waited. I said, thank you. For the letters, both of them. She held my gaze for a moment, just a moment, and something in it was warm and steady, and it went somewhere in me that I'll be able to find for the rest of my life. Then she said, you would have figured it out. And I said, maybe, but I might not have had time. She took that in. She stood there for just another beat, not moving. Her hand rested on the back of the empty chair across from me, briefly, lightly, like a thing that happens without deciding to. Then she nodded, once, clean, and she turned and walked to the door with her even, unhurried gait, the left leg drawing and setting, like a woman who had decided a long time ago that the leg was part of her, and she was part of it and they were going somewhere together, and that was all there was to it. I watched her go out into the lamplit street. I sat there a while longer with the coffee going cold in front of me. Somebody was selling something from a cart at the edge of the block, the same voice, the same 30-second rhythm. 2 men argued briefly about something small and stopped. A child ran across the cobblestones, and a woman called after the child in a voice that wasn't angry, just tired and fond, which is a sound I hadn't heard aimed at anyone in a long time, and which meant something I didn't have a word for. I thought about Breda. About the pipe I'd fixed in the cold bunkhouse on a November morning before anyone was up, before the schoolteacher's first full week was done. I'd fixed it because it needed fixing and I'd been near enough and had the tools. That was all. I hadn't thought about it again. It was one of 10,000 small things, the invisible work of keeping a place functioning, the kind of work that women and men like me do in lives like ours without anyone naming it, without anyone holding it up to the light. She had held it up to the light. She'd carried it 2 years and held it up to the light when I needed it most and said, "I saw you do this. I saw you be this. Whatever they made you into later, whatever they trimmed you down to, I saw the man before that and he was worth seeing." I paid for the coffee. I left a good tip because the girl who'd served us had done it well and had not interrupted us when she could see we were talking, and not interrupting is a skill people don't practice enough. I walked back to the boarding house. The air was cool and the lamps made pools of yellow on the street, and the city went on with its business on all sides of me, not caring that I was in it but not minding either. That's what cities are. They don't see you, but they also don't vote to send you away. Mrs. Garner was in the front hallway when I came in, talking to the young man from printing about some matter involving the week's laundry. She looked up when I came through the door. She said, "Did you find her?" I said, "Yes, ma'am." She said, "Did it go all right?" I said, "I think so." She studied me for a moment the way she'd studied me when I'd arrived, professionally, accurately. Then she seemed to reach a conclusion. She said, "Good, about that pipe in the cellar." I said, "First thing tomorrow." She nodded, went back to the laundry discussion. I went upstairs. I sat on the edge of the bed in the small, clean room with the window looking out on the courtyard, and the young oak tree and the pump. The tree was moving a little in the evening air. The pump was dripping, slow, patient, regular, like it had been doing this for years and planned to go on doing it. I took my boots off, set them side by side the way my father taught me, because he said a man who couldn't take care of his things couldn't take care of anything, and I'd never stopped doing it even in the worst rooms, even when I wasn't sure there was anyone whose opinion about my things mattered. I lay back and looked at the ceiling. It was a better ceiling than the one in Laredo. Plain white plaster with a crack in the east corner that wasn't structural, just old. The lamp made a circle of light on it that went slightly oval because the lamp wasn't quite centered on the table. I looked at it for a while. I thought, I fixed a pipe in a cold bunkhouse 2,300 miles from here, and a woman saw me do it and carried it across those miles in 2 years of her own life and gave it back to me when I had almost nothing else. That is what happened. That is the actual sequence of events. I thought, I am 44 years old. I have a clean room. I have a horse in a good stable. I have a pipe to fix in the morning and possibly a job to pursue with a man named Hanson, and a city to learn, and a woman at the school 4 streets over who writes carefully and sees things, and had, for reasons I was going to spend some time understanding, decided I was worth 2 letters and a door left open. I thought, that is enough to go on with. That is more than enough. In the courtyard below, the pump dripped. The oak tree settled. The city made its night sounds different from the territory's night sounds, a different vocabulary of the dark, but not wrong, just a thing to learn, and I had time to learn it. I fell asleep before I meant to. First good sleep I'd had in a long time.